So hopefully you can all see that first slide now. So yeah, I'm going to be speaking about regulation and enforcement under the Building Safety Act 2022. That's a mugshot of me. um, by way of a bit of background, I'm a barrister, joined Burkitt's in 2019. I'm a legal director at Burkitt's. I specialise in the area of regulatory and criminal law, but have developed a bit of a specialism in public inquiries. At the independent bar, I worked on the Iraq inquiry and the undercover policing inquiry as part of the council team on the undercover policing inquiry. And since joining Burkitt's, I've been representing a core participant to the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which is, of course, of most relevance to this webinar. I've also now been instructed in the COVID-19 inquiry. I'm going to give a bit of background and context for the Building Safety Act, and then focus on a few of the key building safety and in particular fire safety provisions that have been brought in by the Act and how they'll be regulated and enforced. So the Building Safety Act 2022, how did we get here? So the events you see on this slide give you a bit of background as to why this legislation was necessary. Unfortunately, these events and the investigations that followed each of them represent a litany of earlier missed opportunities to tighten fire safety regulations. These are all tragedies, essentially fire safety tragedies. These catastrophic tower block fires over the last 30 years and the lessons that are finally being learnt from them are the foundations for the Building Safety Act 2022 and the Fire Safety Act 2021. The first one you might be familiar with is Knowsley Heights from Merseyside in 1991. I'll give a bit of background to it. It was a fire deliberately started when rubbish was set alight outside the 11-storey Knowsley Heights tower block in Merseyside. The flames began at the bottom of the building and spread through a gap between the wall and the newly installed rain screen cladding, which is something you guys will no doubt be familiar with. Thankfully, there were no fatalities, but on arrival, the fire brigade reported that it was the most frightening thing any of us had ever seen as firefighters, and that the flames were coming from every landing window between the ground floor and the roof. The evidence that's gone before the Grenfell Tower inquiry suggests that the investigation into Knowsley Heights failed to fully address the degree to which the presence of combustible rain screen may have contributed to the spread and the magnitude of the fire. Instead, the focus was heavily on the absence of cavity barriers. So that was the first missed opportunity for change. There then followed Garnet Court in North Ayrshire in Scotland in 1999. It was a fire that spread on the outside of an overclad 14-storey block of flats in Irvine on the 11th of June 1999. The fire started in the living room of a fifth-floor flat and then rapidly spread within 15 minutes to the roof level of the building via its refurbishment external cladding, igniting fires in the living rooms of a vertical line of flats above the flat of fire of origin. One fatality occurred in the flat of origin, sadly. After Garnet Court, when the Parliamentary Select Committee inquiry recommended that a new large-scale cladding test should be substituted for existing small-scale tests, the next edition of the approved documents did not introduce the large-scale test as a replacement, but was instead added as an alternative route to compliance. This was effectively to enable continued and indeed increased use of combustible materials in external walls at height. Next was the Edge in Salford in 2005, a 19-storey residential building in Salford. The 2005 fire occurred whilst the building was under construction, but had been partially occupied. It was originally clad in some locations with panels comprising an expanded polystyrene or EPS filler core with aluminium skins on its inside and outside faces, often referred to in the construction industry as sandwich panels. After the Edge fire, the wording of the relevant clauses in approved document B was clarified, should we say, without fanfare, which led to the now infamous paragraph 12.7, which has been referred to for a lot for any of those who've been following the Grenfell Tower inquiry. It added the words that filler material, so that it now read, in a building with a story 18 meters or more, any insulation product, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. This was seemingly done so as to address specific fire hazards associated with composite metal-faced cladding panels used in external cladding applications. Professor Bisbee, who's a fire safety expert to the inquiry, concluded that in principle, if this clarification had been clearly articulated and widely discussed within the industry, it had the potential to address many of the hazards associated with the use of combustible Class 0 cladding materials and products. However, in practice, the effect of these clarifications was, unfortunately, to create ambiguity and to generate considerable confusion. The next is Lakanal House in Camberwell in London in 2009. On the 3rd of July 2009, sadly, 6 people were killed and at least 20 injured when a fire started by a faulty television set developed and spread through a number of flats in the 14-storey building. An inquest into the deaths at Lakanal House found that the rapid spread of the fire had trapped people in their homes. A 2006 to 2007 refurbishment had seen the replacement of the majority of exterior walls of Lakanal House with a system of aluminium framed window units and combustible composite infill panels. The exterior cladding panels had burned through in less than 5 minutes. Professor Bisbee, again at the Grenfell Tower inquiry, said that in his opinion, Lakanal House provided a mechanism through which these other, much more fundamental and challenging regulatory failings could have been identified. Instead, the fact that the guidance was not followed at Lakanal House appears to have provided a means by which these failings were set aside and dismissed. Then we have Grenfell Tower on the 14th of June 2017. 72 people lost their lives in a fire in a residential tower block started by an electrical fault in a large fridge freezer in the kitchen of flat 16. In 2016, the tower had undergone extensive external refurbishment and was clad with ACM, aluminium composite material, panels with a PE core and PIR and phenolic foam insulation boards. The Grenfell Tower Inquiry Chairman, Sir Martin Moore-Bick, concluded in his Phase 1 report, the principal reason why the flames spread so rapidly up and down and around the building was the presence of the aluminium composite material rain screen panels with polyethylene cores, which acted as a source of fuel. The presence of PIR and phenolic foam insulation boards behind the ACM panels and perhaps components of the window surrounds contributed to the rate and extent of vertical flame spread. Importantly, he further concluded that there was compelling evidence that the external walls of the building failed to comply with the requirement in the building regulations that they should adequately resist the spread of fire, having regard to the height, use, and position of the building. He said that, on the contrary, they actively promoted the spread of fire. So it was that misunderstanding and misapplication of the legislation and regulations surrounding fire safety and the changes that some of which were brought during this period, which precipitated the implementation of the Building Safety Act 2022 and the Fire Safety Act 2021. Before the Act, though, we had and following the Grenfell Tower fire, we had the Hackett report. And I'll just talk a little bit about that. It was chaired by Dame Judith Hackett in the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire. And she was commissioned by the government to conduct an independent review of the building regulations and fire safety. And her conclusions were pretty damning. She concluded the following, that the roles and responsibilities of those procuring, designing, constructing, and maintaining buildings are unclear. The package of regulations and guidance in the form of approved documents can be ambiguous and inconsistent. The processes that drive compliance with building safety requirements are weak and complex, with poor record keeping and change control in too many cases. Competence across the system is patchy. The product testing, labeling, and marketing regime is opaque and insufficient, and the voices of residents often go unheard, even when safety issues are identified. She identified the new regulatory framework because it was clear by this point that one was necessary, that the new framework must address all of those weaknesses if there's to be a stronger focus on creating and maintaining safe buildings. It must strengthen regulatory oversight to create both positive incentives to comply with building safety requirements and to effectively deter non-compliance. It must clarify roles and responsibilities and raise and assure competence levels, as well as improving the quality and performance of construction products. Residents must feel safe and be safe and must be listened to when concerns about building safety are raised. And so she made a series of recommendations. a new regulatory framework focused in the first instance on multi-occupancy higher risk residential buildings that are 10 stories or more in height. A new joint competent authority comprising local authority building standards, fire and rescue authorities, and the health and safety executive to oversee better management of safety risks in these buildings. A mandatory incident reporting mechanism for duty holders with concerns about the safety of higher risk residential buildings. And her report contained a map of the new framework based on the recommendations. It is significantly simpler. This greater simplicity is because of the following key changes. So for a start, same regulatory body overseeing building safety across the life cycle, and that will be the Health and Safety Executive. That's what's been brought in by the Building Safety Act, which we'll come on to. The HSE, are the building safety regulator. Same legislative framework applies across the building's life cycle. Existing overlaps between different legislation and different regulators, in particular the Housing Act 2004 and the Fire Safety Order 2005, have been removed, and there are no longer two parallel but confusingly different building control bodies providing oversight during design and construction. Self-certification processes whereby aspects of building work could be signed off by the individuals doing the work without broader regulatory oversight have been removed. So following the Hackett report, of course, over the last few years, we've had the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which has just concluded hearing evidence, and they are now writing their report. But I'm just going to take you back a little bit to Module 6, which was earlier this year, because Module 6 of the inquiry focused on the government and the regulatory regime that existed at the time in relation to building safety. And that quote up on the screen is one from Richard Millett QC, who's lead counsel to the inquiry. And he opened Module 6 by stating, anybody who has followed the work of this inquiry to date will appreciate that much has already been said, both by factual and by expert witnesses, about the adequacy and the clarity of the regulatory regime which applied to Grenfell Tower during the time of its refurbishment and its management. That is to say, principally the building regulations and the RRO. And as you might imagine, the majority of what has been said points towards significant deficiencies in the existing regulatory regime. The Building Safety Act, in conjunction with the Fire Safety Act 2021, will seek to strengthen and clarify that regulatory regime with the undoubtedly commendable aim of diminishing the chances of a fire like the tragic one at Grenfell occurring again in the future. So I'm going to be discussing three areas that the Building Safety Act is targeting. First, amendments to the Building Act 1984 and the new Building Safety Regulator. I'll move on to then give you a little bit of information about new competence and accountability requirements, particularly for high rises, and then a brief bit of detail about the introduction of new construction products regulations. So the regulatory provisions. So first of all, the Building Safety Regulator. Section 2 of the Building Safety Act creates a new building safety regulator and establishes the Health and Safety Executive, the HSE, as the new building safety regulator. Section 31 introduces the concept of higher risk buildings, which will include all buildings over 18 meters. So all high rises, essentially tower blocks. Section 32 introduces into the Building Act 1984 a new Section 91ZA, making the HSE, as the regulator, the building control authority for all higher risk buildings, taking them out of the hands of local authority building control. The Building Safety Regulator will have three core functions. First, implementing the new, more stringent regulatory regime for higher risk buildings. It means that the Building Control Authority in England, in respect of building work on higher risk buildings, and overseeing and enforcing the new regime in occupation for higher risk buildings. The Building Safety Regulator, the HSE, will have powers necessary to bring together teams, including fire and rescue services and local authority expertise, to assist it in making regulatory decisions. It will be responsible for overseeing the safety and performance of all buildings. This will include developing key performance indicators, KPIs related to building control work, data collection, and powers to impose sanctions for poor performance. understanding and advising on existing and emerging building standards and safety risks, including advising on changes to regulations, changes to the scope of the regime, and commissioning advice on risks in and standards of buildings. And then it will also be responsible for assisting and encouraging competence among the built environment industry and registered building inspectors. Two key elements there: assisting and encouraging improvement in competence of the built environment sector, including establishing and setting the direction of the proposed industry-led competence committee, carrying out research and analysis and publishing non-statutory advice and guidance, and establishing a unified building control profession with competence requirements for registration as a building control professional that will be common across both the public and private sector. And then, importantly, you might think Section 39 of the Building Safety Act amends Section 35 of the Building Act 1984, making contravening building regulations an either way offence, i.e. it's an offence that can go up to the Crown Court. It has a maximum sentence of 2 years imprisonment. Section 35, as was in force, is expressed as a penalty for contravening building regulations, and that it was summary only, i.e. could only be dealt with in the magistrates' court, and therefore was punishable only by a fine. So strengthened the criminal element to it somewhat. So competence and accountability. Section 35 of the Building Safety Act inserts a new paragraph 5C into the Building Act 1984, creating an industry competence requirement for any appointed person or prescribed person. The fire risk assessments conducted in relation to Grenfell Tower following its refurbishment have been the subject of understandable scrutiny, and this provision is seeking to set minimum standards for those appointed into positions such as fire risk assessor. The new paragraph 5C of the Building Act 1984 states the building regulations may, in relation to any work, impose competence requirements on A, any appointed person, or B, any prescribed person. A competence requirement is a requirement relating to the skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours of an individual, the capability of a person other than an individual to perform its functions under building regulations. And Section 72 of the Building Safety Act introduces the concept of accountable persons for higher risk buildings. A person who holds legal estate in possession of any of the common parts, or does not but has repairing obligations in respect to the common parts of a higher risk building, is deemed to be an accountable person. Now, of course, this will mean that there can be multiple accountable persons, but it differs from the requirement for a responsible person. So you will have heard of responsible persons from the RRO, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. By virtue of Article 6 of that, there must be a responsible person for any domestic premises comprising more than just a single private dwelling, and also most work premises. But an accountable person under the new Building Safety Act applies only to higher risk buildings. Statutory instruments will introduce duties on accountable persons and define what those are, but there'll be an ongoing duty to assess building safety risks, taking all reasonable steps to prevent a major incident, providing a safety case report, appointing a competent building safety manager, submitting prescribed documents to the building safety regulator for them to issue the completion certificate, and registering the building and applying for a building assurance certificate. And finally, the last slide, you'll be pleased to hear, is on the construction products regulations, which is under section 146 and schedule 11 of the Building Safety Act. They create the new construction products regulations. They give the Secretary of State the power to make regulations prohibiting the marketing or supply of certain products, or to impose requirements in relation to the marketing and sale of products, even where they are deemed safe products. You will no doubt have heard about the mismarketing of products during the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower, and how products that were intrinsically unsafe ended up on the tower. The aim for this, the way in which this is going to be achieved, is first of all by construction products on the market being made subject to a general safety requirement. Then secondly, by imposing standards of product performance for designated products or products subject to a technical assessment. And then finally, by creating a list of safety critical products where the failure of such products would result in death or serious injury. Designated products, first of all, the Grenfell Tower inquiry and internal and external investigations relating to construction product advertising have highlighted misleading product performance claims. This power for the designated products will allow the Secretary of State to impose requirements on the making of claims or statements about the performance of construction products, including those made in advertising products, and for relevant authorities to investigate, enforce against, and sanction non-compliance with those regulations. Then in terms of the safety critical products, it's clear that the consequences of the Grenfell Tower fire revealed a gap in the regulation of construction products not covered by an EU harmonised standard or conforming to an EU technical assessment, now a designated standard and UK technical assessment, or regulated as a consumer product. The purpose of this power is to remove this gap for products that the Secretary of State identifies as safety critical, meaning products that do not meet their claimed performance will be withdrawn from the market.